Okay, we're going to move to the next topic on our agenda this afternoon. It deals with youth productivity, technology, mechanization, and global value chains. I'd like to introduce Dr. Arslan, who will be the moderator for this next session. Dr. Arslan is a senior research economist at the Research and Impact Assessment Division of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. And she is co-leading IFAD's Rural Development Report 2019 on investing in rural youth. And you have her detailed biographies at your table. I'll now turn it to you, Dr. Arslan.
Thank you very much. Should I stand? Let me just on there. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that sugar high is still there and you're not in there the after lunch kind of downhill. But we have a great set of speakers, Tom Reardon, not least, and our discussant, Lorraine Ronke. Let me just maybe give a just brief introduction and my appreciation actually to USAID and BIFAD for their invitation and for their interest in this very important topic that IFAD has been very much committed to in the last couple of years. And so basically IFAD's senior management has decided that youth engagement in agriculture and ensuring the rural transformation that's inclusive of rural youth was one of the main goals of IFAD in this next, let's say, 10 to 15 years of our investment period. And IFAD is preparing its youth action plan, first ever youth action plan now. It's going to be finalized by the end of September, hopefully, this year. And that this action plan is basically trying to ensure that IFAD has a holistic approach to youth inclusive programming in our investments, in our grants, in our all operations on the field, as well as research, impact assessments, and knowledge management in the headquarters. And as part of an indication maybe of this commitment to youth inclusion into rural transformation process was a decision to do the next rural development report on investing in rural youth for agricultural development. So you heard earlier today from Louise and from Dave about the rural development report's general approach to understanding actually how youth are engaging in different parts of the agri-food system, how like economic participation as well as political and social participation. And basically we have three questions that we would like to answer with this rural development report. These questions might evolve in the next couple of months as we develop them, but three main questions, right? So first one is just to better understand, because as we heard, we haven't actually researched youth as much as we've researched women in the past, or indigenous communities in the case of Latin America that have been subject to a lot of research. So three questions. What are the youth doing exactly? How are they engaging in the economies and the societies that they live in? And how are they managing that transition from dependence to independence, like we've just talked about earlier? And second is what are the key dynamics of change? You heard Dave talk about all these like big forces of change, like very fast compared to what they have been in the past. So what are these key dynamics of change and how they might be different in different regions as well as within regions? Because Rural Development Report, as part of IFAD's general approach as well, has to create like evidence-based concrete action plans that would be specific to both regions and sub-regional heterogeneities that matter. So we're going to also try to understand and underline the importance of looking at maybe the global forces of change, trying to understand like commonalities, but also try to understand policies, institutions, and different regional, sub-regional approaches that might have worked in the past, that might have not, and trying to understand why they didn't work, what works, what doesn't work, right? And the third question, okay, what can governments, civil societies, development partners, private sector, and youth themselves can do to ride this huge wave of change, like really fast transformations in the both rural economy and like the technological developments, this like fast speed of the blockchain and all that. I actually studied blockchain, I don't understand it, so And I'm above 30 anyway, so I think I'm excused. So anyway, three main questions, right? And then these are huge questions, obviously. It's not easy, and as we've heard earlier, evidence is actually pretty much thin, and we're trying to bring all these great minds, and I'm really happy to say that we managed to work with the great minds. Some of them are here today, and Tom Reardon is one of them as well. He's going to join us now. Anyway, so let's just hear from our presenter. And again, thank you for USAID for putting this meeting, and I hope it's going to be like a learning experience, an inspiring experience for all of us, like we've just heard from our young participants. So by way of an introduction for Tom Reardon, is Tom there already?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. Hey, Tom. Actually, I'd like to say that Tom doesn't really need much of an introduction, but just in case, maybe one or two of you in the room might not be familiar with him, he's basically, he's a full professor at the Michigan State University. He's been at MSU since 1992, and he's one of the biggest thinkers and great researchers in studying value chain developments, agri-food system transformations, and then their implications for rural development, poverty, and livelihoods of rural people, and across different continents, right? Because most people in academics, we focus on one continent, a couple of set of countries, because there's a lot of like returns to specialization and also research. But Tom has this amazing diversity of Africa, Latin America, Asia. He can tell amazing, great stories with really important implications for policy and practice. So we're really pleased to have him here. And actually, Dave and I, we also just voted him as the most entertaining presenter, as economist. Too bad you're missing his stage presence, but I'm sure it's going to come through somehow. So that's Tom. And after Tom, we're going to have Lorraine Ronke. Where's Lorraine? Okay, there she is. She's going to be the discussant and the respondent after Tom's presentation. She leads the global agribusiness team in the Industry Solutions Group of the Finance, Competitiveness, Innovation, Global Practice at the World Bank Group. And she was the first global solutions lead for the value chains and agribusiness at the World Bank Group, and where she has engaged in a lot of, she led a lot of agriculture programs and policy dialogues, both from the headquarters and on the field, as far as I understand. And before the World Bank Group, she has worked in the coffee and cocoa sectors, both of the things close to my heart, as well as in research and impact assessments as well, also close to my heart, and in the private sector. So she's worked before her career at the bank, private companies and coffee and chocolate companies. I'd like to talk about that later. And she has a PhD from University of Sussex. So thank you very much. And Tom, I'll try to advance your slides as you speak. So if I miss something, then you can just tell me to go to the next slide, okay? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to speak to you via internet from Indonesia. And I'll be awkwardly saying what is each slide, what is the top part of each slide, just to make sure that it follows along. The talk today for you, is on food systems transformation in Africa and Asia, and trying to draw some implications for youth employment. The main message of the talk is that food systems in both of these regions are transforming extremely rapidly. You just talked about some of the changes that are occurring, and the food systems are essentially the complex or the group of food supply chains and input supply chains, as well as lateral services like transport. All of these systems, all of these value chains are transforming extremely quickly. And one of the main implications I want to emphasize is that this is good news in terms of opportunities for youth employment. So would you please advance the slide? The points that I'm going to make are drawn, in fact, from the IFAD report that was just described, and the chapter is composed of myself and Bart Minton from IFPRI, Louise Fox from USAID, Sawida Liverpool Tassier from MSU, David Shirley, and Michael Doleslager. Please go to the next slide. I'll say a set of 3 key points, and then I'll dig a little deeper into the stages of transformation of the food system. So please go to a slide called Key Points. Over the past 25 years, really a very short time by historical standards, food systems in Africa and Asia have transformed very quickly, and we expect this transformation to continue. In fact, the traditional food systems in Africa and Asia are extremely similar to those in Europe and the US. And the Europe and the US food systems began transforming only about 100 years ago, approximately 10,000 years after settlement in cities, so that for 9,900 years you had traditional food systems all around the world that were extremely similar, Africa to Asia to Europe. But then suddenly, by historical standards, the US system and European system started to change 100 years ago. And then in a very rapid catch-up, only 25 years ago, the food systems in Africa and Asia began to change. What pulled and pushed and facilitated this extremely rapid change? Certainly, it was pulled by rapid urbanization. When you look back at the numbers, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, urban areas were only a small share of the population in these regions. And by today, they're about 40 to 50% of population. But if you look at that in terms of the share of the total food economy, the total food consumption in food markets, it's about 50 to 70%. That means that farmers in the area are by far mainly selling to urban areas when they're selling food, and the total consumption in terms of national food security is now mainly urban. At the same time, that food consumption has changed very much, and I'm sure David talked about that this morning in terms of diversification beyond grains, shift into processed foods, a lot of purchasing of foods by rural households. So these changes essentially downstream in the system have pulled like a train, the food system change. And this whole change has also been facilitated by policy liberalizations like foreign direct investment liberalization, privatization of parastatals, et cetera. That's opened up a lot of opportunities in the market. And further facilitated by, that is the response of the market, further facilitated by huge investments in both of the regions in terms of road improvements, electrification, and other investments. Please go to the next slide. Now, this transformation has been fed by a series of investments. Now, I agree that donors such as USAID and IFAD, and certainly NGOs and others have been making investments in these changes. But if you look at the lion's share, let's say 98% of all the money that's gone into transforming the basic food system, this has come from the pockets of 2 sets of investors. There's been an avalanche of investments spurred by foreign direct investment liberalization as well as internal liberalizations and policy change of a modern revolution where you have investments by large retailers and processors in both of the regions, with some of that modern revolution maybe more advanced in Asia, but certainly emerging and starting and rolling forward in Africa, such as the rise of supermarkets. But you also have, and I think this is even more important for youth employment opportunities, is you see a tidal wave of investments, which we call the quiet revolution, quiet because it hasn't been part of the debate very much, by millions of small and medium enterprises all along the supply chains. These are small enterprises that make and sell inputs in agricultural services. These are small businesses called farms. These are enterprises and workers that are engaged in loading and packing and trucking. We found, for example, in our Nigerian poultry, feed, and maize complex of value chains, that 85% of all of the transport of maize, for example, in Nigeria is done by third-party logistics services, trucking, transport, etc. So this is a very important sector. And then also small and medium enterprises in wholesaling and processing, and also in retail, hawking, and street vending, and shopkeeping. So this is a mass of essentially entrepreneurs voting with their money and their feet and working in the supply chain in every single segment. Please go to the next supply chain, the next slide. A thing that is so interesting to me, as the introduction to me, it was noted that, in fact, I've lived about 35, well, I've spent 35 years working on all three regions, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and 21 years of which I've been in residence in those regions. And what struck me so interestingly is that Africa is essentially on the same transformation path in terms of the food systems as Asia. And Asia's path and Africa's path is very similar to the evolution of the United States food system that I mentioned over the century. The big difference that I see is not the kinds of changes occurring, but rather the speed. The change that's occurring in Africa and Asia is occurring 3 to 5 times faster than what happened in the United States. So that's a blessing in the sense that a lot of the changes I'm going to talk about have been really big opportunities for youth employment, but that's also a challenge because anything that changes that fast presents a lot of challenges. So please go to the next slide. The final overview point is that, as was said, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the situation. One size does not fit all. Essentially, transformation in the food system is happening in 3 stages. First is the traditional stage, which, as I said, the United States was in when my mother was a child. And many places are still in some rural areas of Africa and Asia. But many countries have shifted to the second stage of food system transformation, which I call transitional. And I'll describe a little bit what that means. It's an in-between stage. And then the third stage is the modern sector, the modern food system that you observe in the United States, but also in a number of cities and countries in the 2 regions I talked about. It's important to think in terms of those 3 categories because employment opportunities for youth differ a lot over those categories, as do the challenges. I think that the good news of this talk is basically that the biggest youth job opportunity is in the transition stage. And most of Africa and South Asia is now in the transition stage of food system transformation. And I think that this will continue for the next 20 years at least, maybe 20, 30 years. Where you'll get the bumpy ride will be more when you get to the third stage, where there's modern food systems which present various kinds of challenges for youth jobs, and I'll point that out. But also it's important to realize that if food systems stay stuck at the traditional stage, the sleepy, stagnant, original stage, basically that's also bad news for youth jobs because they aren't being created. I'll go more to that in detail now as I turn to the next stage, please, where I'll focus in on the traditional stage briefly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you just fine, Tom.
Thank you. So the traditional stage, which you find still in some countries and in some zones within many countries, is, as I mentioned, basically a drought for youth employment. In this situation, food supply chains are really short, let's say from farmers to nearby villages. They're basically local food systems. And in that kind of situation, there's very few jobs that are generated off-farm in 2 of the main sectors that generate jobs for youths, which include commerce and transport. And also, there's really very little value added after the farm gate. There's few jobs, for example, in processing, and because urban areas are very limited in the traditional stage, and there's very little street food preparation and vending. And finally, technology is traditional. And it takes a lot of low-paid, own labor to farm and to process their food. And one thing that has so struck me working, coming back essentially after some years, coming back and working in West Africa, is when I worked from 1984 to 1986 in Burkina Faso at night, and in the morning I would hear pounding and pounding all over my neighborhood. It was a lot of young women spending time pounding grain into flour, and now essentially postponing their dreams to go out and get a job and realize some of their career aspirations. They're stuck in the backyard pounding with a mortar and pestle on grain. Now I come back several decades later, I find all of that change. There's mills and a lot of labor-saving devices that, just as my mother was so happy to do, get out of the house and be able to take a job in the early 1960s when the same kinds of changes that were occurring in the U.S. that liberated women from this drudgery of the home work. Next slide, please. After the traditional stage, as I say, with urbanization, with diet change, with a lot of investments, you find now that there's lengthening of supply chains and change in their nature, and this is a real boom for youth employment. As I mentioned, as you go from a rural society where the share of cities is very small, and you start to stretch the food supply chains further and further into rural areas to stabilize the food supply for the cities, to reduce prices for poor urban consumers. At the same time, what you find is that these stretch out and present opportunities for rural people far from the cities. And as I mentioned at the beginning, about 50% to 75% of food in Africa and in Asia is now going to the cities. Exports is about 5%. Now, if you look at what happens when you stretch those supply chains, the same thing that happened in the United States several decades ago, you create a lot of jobs off farm in commerce and transport and handling and storage. It's very exciting because the small and medium enterprises that bubble up and proliferate in this stage are fantastic. And an example that we found in our research that was actually quite ignored and outside of a lot of the debate was what we call an overnight revolution in small and medium enterprises in cold storages in Agra. This is the Taj Mahal area in India, supplying Delhi, which is, if you take the size of Delhi as a population and the surrounding areas that are pretty much part of Delhi, you have a population the size of France. So basically, near there, 3 or 4 hours away, you have a potato production area that within 10 years shifted from 1% of the farmers using cold storages to 99% using modern cold storages. And with that, masses of employment was created. Jobs were created in terms of loading and handling and storing in these cold storages. So that's an example where hooking up to the effective demand of the cities and improving the supply chain services done by small and medium enterprises. These are not multinational firms that set these up. These are local people setting it up, employed a lot of people, including mostly youths. Next slide, please. Transition stage continued. Another thing that really is quite striking is that, and I'm sure David talked about that this morning, is urban and rural diets have so changed by the transitional stage that we observe in places as diverse as Bangladesh and Nigeria. The diets have changed, which has increased the demand for labor-intensive activities on the farm, the high-value activities that are now about 2/3 to 3/4 of the consumption spending by rural and urban people in these regions. And this is particularly in horticulture, livestock products, and fish. And what you find in both of these regions is that young entrepreneurs, as we heard just before my talk, are following the money. They're looking into and starting lots of businesses. Somebody from USA just emailed me to note that a lot of youth are starting pisciculture, the fish farming in Mali, in urban areas, in rural areas, following the money. So this is very exciting. We looked at a case of northern Nigeria and examined whether women, as well as young women especially, were getting involved in poultry farming, because a lot of the conventional image is that the poultry was just grown for home consumption and not marketed, and women weren't getting involved in it. But what we found was extremely contrary to that. We found that thousands and thousands of young women are involved in poultry farming, handling, and retail, mainly selling into the small towns and the rural towns and the cities in northern Nigeria. So this is an example where, as those effective demand sources increased, there was a response by young entrepreneurs. Another case, stretching over to Asia, to Bangladesh, we studied fish farming and found that basically only for the domestic market, because none of the fish are exported, the fish market grew by 1,500% in 2 decades. That's 15 times. And this is such good news, because as these fish farms spread throughout Bangladesh, supplying the cities basically, they created a lot of employment, because people shifted from rice into fish, and that provides 2 times more jobs per hectare and about 5 times the income per hectare that rice was producing for these people. So basically, youths are getting involved in these high-value products that are being demanded more and more and more by cities in the region. Next slide, please. Another important shift that's occurred is along the same lines of youth following the money. As I noted, as you stretch supply chains and increase the amount of processed products and handled products, you get a proliferation of off-farm employment into what, especially in the transition stage, are very labor-intensive activities, as well as in the farm, the high-value farm activities. As labor is drawn off traditional, low-paying drudgery of own farming and drawn off from the home production activities because of labor-saving devices and processed food, you start to tighten the labor market. And so labor becomes scarcer. This pushes wages up, and poor people start to increase the wages that they're earning. In this situation, what we found in many of the countries is that farmers, both the young farmers and the older farmers, start to switch to machines, to mechanization, in order to free their time from, say, the drudgery of harvesting or of weeding. And one example that we saw that was mainly youth in the hills and valleys of Shan State in Myanmar, where I just came back from, is an amazing adoption of farm machines, both to prepare the land and also mobile farm services to combine, to harvest and thresh, saving a lot of time and liberating the farmers to both start to diversify into other products beside grain, shift more into the high-paying maize, and also work off-farm, increasing their off-farm job opportunities. So mechanization is a response to increasing labor costs, which are themselves coming from the tightening of the labor market, because there's just so much darn opportunity that's welling up in the various areas. I'll never forget, just a couple of weeks ago, talking to a farmer that was shifting into using machines for their farm to save their time. And I said, why don't you just use the very cheap labor that was available from the dry zone in Myanmar, that you used to get cheap rural labor coming in. And he said, it's a pity, because now in the dry zone, there's so many opportunities due to horticulture and off-farm activity there, that now we're not getting those rural migrants anymore. They can find jobs in their home state, and we're stuck here with increasing labor costs and labor access problems, so we're shifting to machines.
Tom.
So in many ways, this is a response to what's been an increase in the potential as well as the performance of the labor market.
Tom,
Next
this is
slide,
Louise.
please.
Sorry, I just wanted to warn you that we're getting short on time.
Yes, I'm wrapping up here.
Great, thanks.
So with this diet change and in the transition, there's been also a spread of off-farm activities such as milling enterprises and other time-liberating technologies and products. As I mentioned, that this has also started to free young women to start rural and urban food preparation enterprises to pursue their dreams. We're doing a study right now for USAID on the proliferation of small enterprises selling prepared millet dishes in urban and rural Senegal. And this is occurring also in Nigeria and Mali and others, where these enterprises are offering a lot of opportunity for youth. Next slide, please. And the last slide for the transition stage. This transition stage then is a situation where the food system is growing very quickly, adding value added, adding jobs, adding opportunities. And the good thing about this stage, which Africa and Asia are facing, especially South Asia, are facing for the next 20 years or so, is that the entry requirements for these jobs are relatively low. There's a lot of people seeking jobs, but it's not that arduous and difficult in terms of skills and investment to start these small and medium enterprises. This is very much like the job market that my parents faced in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, where lots of people entered the job market because the entry requirements were not yet very arduous. Now, I say 1950s, 1960s, I realize that's not comparing the food systems to the 1950s, 1960s in the U.S. because, as was mentioned, information technology and a lot of things that allow youth, in fact, to find jobs and keep jobs has increased over that time. But in terms of it being a time of opportunity and easy entry, this is the time we're in. So I want you to turn to the next slide. And to see that, in fact, as the transformation occurs, you come to the modern stage where there's supermarkets and large processors. And in this stage, you basically have challenges for youth workers skyrocketing, but especially if they have low skills. So this is very much like the situation that you face in Thailand or Mexico today or in the United States, where supermarkets and large processing firms are competing very well with small and medium enterprises. You're finding mechanization and automation all along supply chains, which is reducing demand for low-skilled labor. You're also finding that the market's demanding more and more quality and food safety, which means that those requirements and the needed investments to make the grade face young entrepreneurs. So the requirements in skills and investments in the modern stage, which is coming in both Africa and South Asia, and really already emerging, those requirements rise sharply and present challenges to youth. Next slide and final slide, please. So in sum, what I've tried to show is that the youth job opportunities change over the path of food system transformation. They're very poor in the stagnant and traditional food systems, but then they skyrocket during this 20-30 year period that we're in right now, when there's urbanization and diet change, roads, ICT, etc. And then when you come, as is already emerging, to the modern stages of food system transformation, that's where Africa and Asia more and more face the same kind of challenges that youth employment faces in Europe and the US, where the requirements and skills and investments rises sharply. So the chances for inclusive growth in youth employment depend on meeting the different challenges faced by youth in each stage of the food system transformation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So now we'll hear from Lorraine Ronke about her responses and maybe some reflections based on Tom's talk. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Tom, for presenting this much-needed framework on a very important topic. I don't know if we can have up that conclusion slide from Tom's presentation, but what we see across these three stages of traditional, transitional, and modern, it's the evolution of the food system, as been described earlier today, and also the evolution of the private sector investment opportunities all along it, of all sizes. And then marrying that together in this framework with the evolution or the differences in the opportunities and constraints specific to youth employment across those three, that's very useful, and it's not something that is sort of well developed, let's say, empirically until now. So having a framework like that from an operational and from a policy perspective is a very useful thing. And there's basically two premises in there, right? First, that the private sector is the driver of job creation, and so it's important to understand how the markets evolve in broad terms and where we could expect the private sector investment to see that opportunity, right? The second is that ensuring inclusion of youth in those different phases, the different phases that Tom has put up for us. Yet one is much better understood than the other. How to leverage in private sector investment of all sizes to maximize finance for development in agri has received a good bit of attention. And it can draw on a substantial literature and experience around enabling investment climate, and what works, right? So this is everything from competition reform to investment policy, or all the experience around SME and farmer linkages for inclusive agribusiness development. It's about hard infrastructure like roads. It's about soft infrastructure like food safety, a move to risk-based food safety systems, how we get to market. And it's also around sector-specific policies and regulations. So we know a lot about how sector-specific regulations, policies, procedures impact and disproportionately on small firms, the competitiveness of these firms. And that's a big deal. And I think that we know a lot more about that than we do about the other side, about what works. And that's what we were hearing Dr. Fox and others saying earlier today about, while we know what the key reforms and investments are on the sort of demand side, of course, there's always room for more research, particularly along, what the public and private role should be in there. It's not the same on the other side about along this sort of evolving food system, what do we know about what works in terms of inclusion in jobs and in employment? And so in Tom's presentation, as brief as it was, you start to see how that might vary. And getting good empirics and good data around that is going to be really important to this process, to this evolution, which is a very real thing. I guess, therefore, when I think back to what Dr. Fox was saying this morning, we're linking necessarily what we know about private sector development in the food system with a research agenda about youth participation. And so from a policy and operational perspective, much needed, and from that perspective, just one or two comments. So Tom, you presented a really plausible framework where we see that the characteristics of the three phases will imply a different set of opportunities and a different set of challenges and actions for youth, right? So you can imagine that a government or development partners find themselves working in what is essentially a traditional or an early transitional country, and the kind of evidence bases, the kind of research that is being proposed here then guides policy and investments around a set of actions. And it's equally possible that a government and partners find themselves in a late transitional or modern phase when they first start thinking about this. Okay, so they face a different set of opportunities and constraints, and Tom, you had it in all caps that the constraints in the modern phase for youth is, they're very challenging. So the question is, if the evidence, current, what we know now, and future, show that the transitional phase is really the entry point or the precursor for youth engagement and the success in the modern phase, then what do we do when we find that we're late in the game? And that's sort of one question I have for you, Tom, and your colleagues who are working in this. To what degree in the framework is the overall state of the food system in the country, say modern or late transitional, to what degree is it separable, say, from the traditional transitional state of a particular value chain in that country? So you may have some value chains, some subsectors, some segments that are less developed in an otherwise, rapidly transitioning, almost modern country. And are you envisioning that? Is there data or even a research question around how that might be an entry point, so that even though it's very useful to have these broad categories of where a country's food system is within, and that already introduces more heterogeneity than is normal in the discussion, and that's the real value add here. But that within one of those systems we have that heterogeneity, what the implications are that for an entry point for the youth. And the second comment I wanted to make from a policy and operational perspective was about extending and applying this youth employment lens to other bodies of known or evolving research in private sector development, which is the part of the bank that I come from. In particular, two areas. One is on spatial solutions. what is actually the size and scope of agribusiness investments that we hear developing in these secondary and tertiary towns? You know, we know that for some countries, but it's really hard to come by in a lot of the countries that we work in. And when we talk about youth unemployment, being concentrated in low and middle income countries in rural areas, you know, it's kind of an important question. And one of these areas that Dr. Fox referred to, we just don't have good data. So linking up what you're saying about, you know, in the phases we need to look at the constraints and opportunities for youth employment and matching that up with what we know about the development of agribusiness in rural spaces, what makes it tick, what makes it grow, what constrains it, I think is going to be a very impactful area of policy and support going forward. So that would really be welcome. And it's also true to link what we know about SMEs and entrepreneurship. So these are the heroes of Tom's Quiet Revolution, more generally with this proposed lens for jobs. And I'm thinking, this is the one I want to end on, I'm thinking of the evidence. There's some evidence that there's this subset of high growth entrepreneurs. Maybe we've met some of them today, and they punch their weight, above their weight, in terms of net job creation. And that has been shown most robustly using US data, but there's some descriptive data from developing countries that indicates that this is probably true. So why is this interesting for youth, you know, for this session on youth, is that when they look at who these high growth entrepreneurs are, they tend to be between 35 and 45 years of age. So not youth, sadly. But guess what? They have a certain degree of work experience, a threshold of years working in a larger firm in the same sector before they move on and branch out and then create their own businesses. The churn of these businesses is the one that's now being credited for the net job growth that we see. So it suggests a further important hypothesis that the high growth entrepreneurs of tomorrow, given their age, that they're 35 to 45, are the youth working in larger firms in a modernizing sector today. Right? So I don't know what that makes it, you know, postmodern. Tom, do you have room for postmodern phase? Because in this phase, this linear, you have this sort of spin-off, or maybe it's a virtuous circle, right? You have this spin-off effect in addition to solutions for job creation today for youth. So I have to say that I think that this framework could really contribute to our practical understanding of these important questions, because we know a lot about many things, and bringing them together is actually going to be very important as we move forward. So many thanks to Tom and team for bringing this up. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for the very interesting comments and questions. Tom, would you like to take the couple of questions that she raised for you, and then we take questions from our BIFAD members before turning to the audience?
Yes, thank you so much. Lorraine, this is a fantastic set of comments, and I have 3 quick points. I think that one thing that I want to emphasize is that in all of the cases of our studies that I think I'm getting an echo here. In all of the cases of the Quiet Revolution, what we found is that our information was very often the very first information that was available on how quickly and deeply the supply chains were changing. And so while we already know a lot about what to do in terms of policy and program actions to help entrepreneurs once we find out that they're there, what I've been noticing all around Asia and Africa is that that's why we call it the Quiet Revolution. A lot of it is off the radar screen. And an example that I just saw in Nigeria was there was a discussion that was taking place in the government circles and donor circles in Abuja, and there was a lament that was being voiced that there just is an onslaught of imported fish, but very little fish coming from fish farms in Nigeria itself to feed places like Abuja and other cities. And right after that, we started part of our research and looked and found that in the wholesale markets, right there in Abuja, there were hundreds of vans that had been emptied of chairs and vats of water full of fish from the southwest of Nigeria coming in live, transported over 1,000 miles. And they were coming in constantly to the market all day. And so in a sense, a lot of this ferment of activity that's occurring is under the radar screen. Now, secondly, once you know that activity is occurring, you realize that our job, as well as the government's job, is not to create activity, to dream it up and establish it, but rather, I think, to do a jujitsu, where the things, many of these supply chains are already transforming and growing rapidly. And the issue is how to help them to grow even more quickly and to be even more inclusive of youth employment. So understanding what's happening in the transformation of these particular supply chains and then helping that to be a leverage is very important. The third point, I think you made a fantastic point, that within a given country, you find that even for the same kind of product, there can be two different stages of food system transformation. What really hits me coming back recently from northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria is that and we have a big study on this, basically the chicken and egg supply chains in southern Nigeria are already what I would call in the late transitional and early modern stage. So that the challenges that are facing youth employment in that area and this particular kinds of skill improvements and investments that are needed and specific public infrastructure that are needed to make this become even larger and more inclusive are very different from what we saw in northern Nigeria, where in fact the supply chain of chicken and egg is growing extremely quickly. Youth, women are being involved very much by their entrepreneurial skills, but the basic actions that need to be taken are fundamentally different than what you would see in southern Nigeria. In northern Nigeria, it's just helping them to learn and put themselves in the position to get the product into market, just to be able to grow the products and move them into the market. The skills are fundamentally different than in a situation where they're facing competition and requirements for quality, safety, and consistency and volume that you would find in southern Nigeria. So picking that apart and understanding the concrete things on the ground of how those situations differ allow you to differentiate your strategic and action response to the two different kinds of food systems for the same product in the same country. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. We have about 5 minutes before we need to break for coffee, so I will first get questions from our BIFAD members, if there are any, and then maybe just one or two questions from the audience. And we're going to have to be very quick, actually. Any questions? Yeah, we have one.
Hi, Tom. This is Pamela Anderson. Thank you for that fabulous presentation. It's a combination comment question. A lot of the value chain work that I've been seeing over the last 20 years has really been looking at how do you target socially, economically marginalized populations and try and link them into these opportunities that are emerging in the transition stage. And then when we got a little bit more developed, we said, and yes, how do we make sure that some of that income is going into women's pockets to empower and give agency? This whole conversation on youth, I mean, you're kind of scratching your head and say, why did it take us so long to get to this part of the conversation? But the question that I really have is, as you have been looking at this, and we talked about it in previous sessions, what we found with dealing particularly with a lot of the small farmer communities is we did need to do specific training on business skills, on negotiation skills, facilitating engagement to build trust. What would you say are the key interventions if we're going to really target and try and pull youth into these value chain transitional context opportunities?
Thanks, Pamela.
Yes, thank you. I think that, in a sense,
Tom,
Lorraine
just a sec. Should I get one more question? Okay, let me get one more question, and then we'll turn to you for quick answers to both, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
No one? I guess everybody wants coffee. Okay, Tom, you may reply.
Okay. It's 2 o'clock in the morning here, so I'll probably get some coffee too.
Wow.
But I think that Pamela's point is fantastic, that you have to do a series of actions and that involve business skills and other kinds of capacities. And I think besides those sorts of skills and education and information, which can be provided by the information technology as well as other traditional means, you could call those soft infrastructure in a way, all of those things. You also have a lot of different kinds of specific hard infrastructure that's necessary. And one of the things that happened in this cold storage boom in Agra was that you had electrification, you had road improvement. A lot of things changed that were very specific to the needs of the cold storages, for example. And then once those things were in place and they were able to hook to the market and they had the right kinds of potato varieties that were resistant to storage and to diseases, basically then you have this incredible takeoff and boom with a fundamental change over 10 years only. And so I think that if you compare the situation, for example, in Delhi or near Delhi, where you have a market that's pretty close, you're in a competitive situation with a rapid need for ramping up. And there, the business skills and infrastructure and other kinds of interventions will differ from if you're a little further from Delhi. Let's say you're in Bihar, which is a poor area, and there you might need more basic skills and more basic infrastructure. And then as it takes off, then you'll need to shift into the same kinds of skills and infrastructure that you would introduce in the transition situation of Agra near Delhi. So it's a kind of a value ladder as well as a ladder of interventions that you're going to need depending on where you're starting from with the different communities. But one thing that we found both in Africa and in Asia is that now, and I'm sure the point was made this morning, now very, very few farm households, even in the mountains of Myanmar, where I just came back from, frightened to death by riding on roads in the sky, basically you found that there was very, very few communities that were not connected to the market, either the labor market or the product market or both. So that most of the communities in these regions are not in the true hinterland, but they're connected to some way to cities, so that you'll have these gradations from difficult and early to medium to high in terms of degrees of advancement and the challenges that will be also in gradations along that spectrum. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks for staying up late for us. We really appreciate your lively presentation in spite of 2 a.m. in the morning. So we break for coffee here, and thanks a lot for the question that we received, and bye. Good night.
Thank you so much.